If you've been told that you're having a threatened miscarriage, you're probably feeling really worried, stressed, and probably a little bit confused. Does a threatened miscarriage mean that you're actually miscarrying? What does bleeding in pregnancy mean? Today we're going to talk about what happened to me and my experience with bleeding in pregnancy, and I do want to say from the outset that this is a happy success story. In fact, the success is right here. This is Clara and she is 12 weeks old, and her pregnancy was the pregnancy that I had the bleeding in. This is the first time I've ever experienced bleeding in a successful pregnancy. I have had bleeding in other pregnancies before, and just to touch on that a little bit, I have 3 children, a boy, and then after him we had 4 consecutive miscarriages. I do have lots of videos on the topic of miscarriage and pregnancy loss on my channel already if you want to go and have a look at those. Then we were very lucky to have our second son. He was our rainbow baby, our success after our losses, and then after him, while we were trying to conceive our third, we had another miscarriage, and then we got pregnant with Clara. In all my miscarriages, they've all started pretty much the same way, with bleeding and sometimes cramping too. The bleeding has always been kind of orangey brown, and I've always noticed it when I went to the toilet to wipe. You can imagine then how worried I was when I found out that I was bleeding with my pregnancy, with this pregnancy. So what happened was I went to the toilet, I wiped, and there was orangey brown blood on the toilet paper. And to be perfectly honest, I just had the thought of, here we go again, because I knew that I was having another miscarriage. And to be honest, half of me thought there's not even any point going to the doctors or ringing anybody up about this, because I'm just going to let nature take its course. I've always had natural miscarriages before, and I was pretty sure that that is what was happening again. The bleeding wasn't consistent. It wasn't every time I went to the toilet, and it wasn't loads. It definitely wasn't bright red, and it didn't have any clots. But on the second day, there was some red spotting. So just like when you're starting your period or the very, very tail end of your period, that's what it was like. I have to say that that is how my miscarriages started as well. But remember that this is a positive story. There was a little niggle in the back of my mind that made me think I need to ring the doctors just to be 100% sure that that is what is happening. So I rang the hospital, actually. I rang my midwife, and they put me through to the hospital, to the early pregnancy unit. If you are in the UK, all NHS hospitals will have some form of early pregnancy unit, and that is where you will be referred to if you're having any type of bleeding or any other early pregnancy worries, including if you're having a miscarriage. I rang up the early pregnancy unit and they booked me in for a scan the following day when I was approximately 6 weeks pregnant. I didn't know the exact dates, but it was around 6 weeks pregnant. I was absolutely terrified waiting for that scan, and I just sat there in the waiting room during the pandemic, so I was on my own, and thinking this is just going to be bad news. I know it's going to be bad news. And I went in for the scan. Now, I will prepare you for the fact that if you have an early scan, if you have any bleeding in your pregnancy and they send you for an early scan, then it will be a vaginal scan. So they have, I think they call it a wand. It's basically like a stick, for want of a better word, a smooth one. And they put it inside you to be able to see, because doing an ultrasound on your stomach wouldn't be very effective in an early scan. It doesn't hurt at all, but it can feel a little bit uncomfortable because sometimes they press quite hard, especially if you're early on, because they really need to be able to see clearly. You also have to make sure that you drink a lot of water before you go for your scan. Make sure you drink loads, even if you're feeling sick, because the more you drink, the more easy it is for them to see something. So when I went for my 6-week scan, they were able to see a tiny little baby, fetal pole it's called at that stage, but there was no heartbeat. So it was half good news because there was something there. I was pregnant in some sense, but there was no heartbeat. And of course, we didn't know then whether that meant that I was miscarrying or whether it was just too soon to see a heartbeat, which sometimes it can be at 6 weeks. I think generally babies' hearts start beating around that point. So it's hit or miss as to whether you will see a heartbeat when you go for that scan. When they did the scan, they found what's called a subchorionic bleed. So that is basically where the embryo attaches to the wall of your uterus and it creates a bleed in between the embryo and the uterus. So there's blood basically trapped in between, and that blood can come out, and that's what you see when you see the bleeding. Now, the reason that it can be dangerous is because sometimes if that bleeding increases, it can actually wash away the embryo or dislodge the embryo. And that was something the midwife talked to me about afterwards, and the fact that really there's nothing you can do. Some doctors will tell you to take bed rest and keep your feet up and take it easy. I did ask and they said I could do it if I wanted to, if it would make me feel better. Don't do any heavy lifting, try not to pick up my children, my older children, just take it easy. But that there was no evidence that that would actually help anything. It's just more for your own peace of mind, knowing that you've done everything possible. So it's entirely up to you whether you do that or not. I went to speak to the midwife afterwards and she basically told me I might be miscarrying, I might not, but they called it a threatened miscarriage, which can be really worrying for you if that is what's playing on your mind, because it makes you think there's no hope, when actually there is hope still that your pregnancy can be a success. So I was booked in for a scan the following week. The baby was given a week to grow, with the thought being that if there wasn't a heartbeat at that second scan, it would most likely mean that my body was miscarrying. I went back at 7 weeks pregnant. Oh, the wait in between that 6 and 7 weeks was so nerve-wracking. And because I continued to bleed up until that 7-week point and beyond, I was thinking that the worst was definitely happening. It was still the same kind of blood as before. It hadn't picked up at all. I went for my 7-week scan and lo and behold, there was a tiny little bean with a heartbeat, and I will put the picture up on the screen of the scan so you know what to expect when you go for a scan at 7 weeks. You really can't see all that much at all. And in actual fact, there were 2 sonographers in the room with me, a student and the teacher, the main sonographer. The student was the one that scanned me first, although I didn't actually know she was a student at the time, which made it more worrying. And she couldn't find anything. She couldn't find a heartbeat and she couldn't find the baby. And they scanned for quite a while. They actually used both the stomach ultrasound and the vaginal ultrasound, and they couldn't find anything. The main sonographer then came on and said, let me just take a little look here, and she found it almost straight away. She said the heartbeat looked quite faint and it was just a little flicker, but that it was definitely there. At that 7-week scan, they could still see the bleed, and in fact it had got bigger than the week before, which was slightly worrying. It was also changing shape, which is interesting, although I don't think that that means anything, whether positive or negative. She still didn't give me 100% hope that that meant that something good was going to happen or that I was going to have a successful pregnancy. There was a heartbeat at that point, a little flicker, but it didn't mean that it was going to last. So I was booked in for another scan at 9 weeks pregnant, so 2 weeks after that. The next 2 weeks, my bleeding slowed down quite significantly, and to be honest, wasn't really there at all most days. Some days it came back maybe just once when I went to the toilet. As I said, it was never a consistent flow like being on a period. So here is a picture of Clara when she was just 9 weeks inside my stomach, and you can see the difference between 7 and 9 weeks. Boy, what a difference. It's amazing how quickly they grow, isn't it? Again, the bleed was still there at 9 weeks, but it hadn't grown from 7 weeks, which was reassuring. I had bled a couple of days before the 9-week scan, which was worrying me a little bit, but the heartbeat was strong and everything else looked positive. I then had to wait until my 12-week scan, which is the normal dating scan that you get if you're in the UK. It is normally around 12 weeks. I know that in other countries, especially in America, you tend to have that dating scan a little bit sooner than 12 weeks, normally around the 9 or 10 week mark, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. Basically, all we had to do then was wait and see whether the bleed was going to get bigger or smaller and whether the baby was going to keep on growing. So the bleed actually remained at 12 weeks and at 20 weeks. But the good news was that it was getting slowly smaller. Now, I do know of women whose bleeds kind of stayed the same size throughout the whole of their pregnancy, and it didn't actually have any detrimental effect on their pregnancy. So if yours isn't getting smaller, obviously take your doctor's advice, but try not to panic about it because it doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. Clara grew strong and healthy in there, and the bleeding tapered off, and I didn't actually get any more for the rest of that pregnancy. Not even right at the end, when sometimes you get that bloody show just before you go into labour. It's definitely worrying, bleeding in early pregnancy, especially if you've had miscarriages and pregnancy losses before, because the symptoms are surprisingly similar. I do have to add as well that I did have some cramping with this bleeding, but cramping in early pregnancy on its own can be very normal. But it just goes to show that it doesn't always mean something bad, and if I could go back and tell myself that now, I would be very reassured that everything was going to be okay. So I'm really hoping that I can reassure some of you, if you're experiencing this, that you've got every hope and chance of, in 9 months' time or 8 months' time, having a baby sitting on your knee just like this. If you're suffering with pregnancy anxiety, which can be really common, especially if you're having bleeding in pregnancy or if you have suffered with miscarriage before, then check out my pregnancy anxiety video. It is a great watch and hopefully will be really reassuring to you. Read the comments because there's lots of reassuring ones in there from other people going through the same thing.